Every day you do not move, the price of entry goes up. Not metaphorically, literally. The asset that cost $40,000 3 years ago costs $68,000 today. The index fund position that would have compounded quietly in the background has been compounding for someone else. The window of low barrier, high leverage entry that your parents never had and that your children will almost certainly not have is open right now, in this specific economic moment, and it is closing by degrees so gradual you cannot feel them. Here is the contradiction nobody is telling you clearly enough. The people who are already inside the system do not need you to act. They need you to wait. Every year you spend believing you will start when things settle down, when you earn a little more, when the timing feels right. That year is not neutral. It is purchased. Someone buys it from you at a price you never agreed to. You have heard versions of this before. You have heard that time is money, that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world, that you should start early. What you have not heard is why 2026 specifically, not 2027, not next decade, is the year the door narrows. Not a market dip that recovers. A closing. Structural, not cyclical. What you are about to hear is not motivation. It is a map, drawn from where the actual pressure points are right now, and where they will be 12 months from now, and what the difference between those two moments costs someone exactly like you. By the time this ends, you will not hear the word later the same way again. Chapter 1. The wealth window has an expiration date. Every generation carries inside it a story about how things could have been different. You hear it in the voice of someone older, a relative or a neighbor saying they had the chance once. A piece of land, a company in its early days, a neighborhood before everything changed, and they did not move. Not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked desire, but because they did not recognize while they were standing inside it that they were standing inside a window. They thought there was more time. There is always, in that story, the quiet devastation of a door that was open and is now closed. What you are about to hear is not a prediction. It is a pattern. And the reason it matters to you, specifically, right now, in the life you are actually living, is that the window is open at this moment. The question is whether you will recognize it before it closes. Here is what that means in real terms. Right now, in 2026, a set of economic conditions exist simultaneously that do not exist together very often. Asset prices in certain categories have reset. Policy environments are in transition. Technology tools that once required significant capital or institutional access are sitting in the hands of anyone with a device and a willingness to learn. Those three conditions converging is not normal. It is a brief alignment. And the reason most people will miss it is the same reason people have always missed these moments. Not because the window was invisible, but because missing it felt, in the moment, like the responsible choice. That word, responsible, is worth pausing on. One of the quietest lies ever told about wealth is that waiting is the safe option. That caution is wisdom. That starting later, once things are more certain, once you have more saved, once the market settles, once life gets less complicated, is the reasonable path. Once. This book exists to show you that the delayed start myth is not a neutral belief. It is the primary mechanism by which the wealth gap sustains itself across generations. It does not need to deceive you actively. It only needs you to keep waiting. Go back to your actual circumstances 3 years earlier. Not abstractly, actually think about it. What were you earning? What did you own? What did you believe was possible for someone in your specific circumstances? Now consider what you know today that you did not know then. The things that seem obvious now. The moves that look clear in hindsight. The prices and conditions that were present and that you either did not notice or noticed and did not act on. That distance between 3 years ago and today is not just memory. It is the shape of the window you were standing in without knowing it. This is the mirror every generation eventually holds up. Most people see it too late. Now here is the open loop this chapter will carry you toward. There is a specific mechanism, one that most people in your position have never been told directly, by which windows like this one do not simply close. They close for some people and stay open for others. Not because of luck, not because of connections, but because of a particular kind of awareness about structural timing. You will understand exactly what that mechanism is before this chapter ends. But first, you need to understand why this moment is different from the vague urgency you have heard before. Here is a story about a woman named Clara. Clara grew up in a mid-sized city where her parents rented the same apartment for 22 years. Not because they preferred renting, because they believed homeownership was for people with a certain kind of stability they had not yet achieved. There was always a reason it was not the right time. Too much debt one year, a job change the next. Interest rates climbed and they waited for them to drop. Then they dropped and something else came up. Clara watched this. She absorbed the logic of it the way children absorb everything, not through argument but through observation. By the time she was 28, she had internalized it completely without ever deciding to. She was also renting, also waiting. Then her friend David bought a small property, not in a prestigious location, a modest duplex in a transitioning neighborhood, financed with a loan Clara assumed was out of her reach. She watched David struggle with it, deal with a difficult tenant, face a repair she thought would sink him. And then she watched, over 4 years, as his net worth climbed in a direction hers did not. Not because he was smarter. They had the same education. Not because he earned more. They earned nearly the same income. But David had no inherited belief that the right time was always slightly ahead of now. He had simply looked at the window while it was open and walked through it. Clara eventually bought property, 7 years after David did, in a market that had moved significantly. The window was not entirely closed. It rarely closes all the way at once, but the entry point had changed in ways that required her to work harder for gains that had come more easily earlier. She did not lose, but she carried the cost of waiting in a way she had not expected to. A quiet, structural cost that compounded in reverse. What Clara's story is not about is real estate. Let that detail go. What it is about is the relationship between inherited belief and structural timing. Clara did not choose to believe that wealth building was for later. She received that belief as protection, her family's honest attempt to keep her safe from risk. And that belief, however lovingly delivered, was the mechanism that kept the gap in place. This is the first-generation edge. It is worth naming clearly. When you are the first in your family to think seriously about building wealth, not surviving, not maintaining, but actually building, you do not have a disadvantage. You have a specific and powerful advantage. You have nothing to unlearn about what kind of person wealth is for. You have no family story telling you that the window is for someone else. You have only the window and the choice of whether to look at it directly. What closes windows is not time alone. This is the mechanism you have been waiting to understand. Windows close through a convergence of two forces. The first is price discovery. When an asset or an opportunity is underpriced relative to its actual value, the window is open. Once the market understands what it is worth, prices adjust and the entry advantage disappears. The second force is access contraction. Early in any significant shift, technological, policy-driven, economic, the tools and pathways to participate are widely available. As the opportunity matures, barriers appear. Platforms consolidate. Regulation favors incumbents. Capital requirements rise. What was accessible to someone starting from zero becomes accessible only to someone who already has something. Right now, in 2026, you are at the early to middle stage of both cycles simultaneously. Price discovery on certain asset classes and technology-enabled income pathways is still incomplete. Access, while it is narrowing, has not yet contracted to the point where entry requires credentials or capital that you do not have. The window is open. It is measurably open, and it will not stay this way indefinitely. How long does a window like this stay open? The honest answer is that no one can give you a precise date, but the pattern across every comparable moment in economic history suggests the useful window compresses faster than it expands. It opens slowly over years. It closes quickly, often within 18 to 36 months of reaching peak accessibility. You are inside that period right now. And here is what makes this different from the vague urgency you have heard in other places. This is not an argument for panic or for reckless action. The worst thing you could do with a closing window is rush through it without looking where you are stepping. What this book is built to give you is not urgency without direction. It is clarity, a clear view of what the window actually contains, which specific pathways remain accessible, and which ones have already closed or will close before you could meaningfully reach them. Before long, we turn toward an argument about risk that clashes with the familiar story. Once that becomes real to you, it changes how you make every financial decision going forward. For now, return to the pattern this chapter opened with. Every generation has its window. The people who moved through it did not always do so with perfect information or perfect confidence. Some of them were scared. Some of them were not ready in every way they wished they were. But they shared one thing. They looked at the window directly and recognized it for what it was while they were still standing in front of it. The window is in front of you right now. The only question worth asking at the end of this chapter is this one. What would it cost you, in specific and concrete terms, to wait one more year? Chapter 2. Your parents could not teach you this. Saving money will not make you wealthy. Almost every person you know believes it will. They clip coupons, they open high-yield savings accounts, they tell themselves that discipline is the key, that patience is the key. They are not slightly wrong. They are operating from a map drawn for a completely different destination. This map has been passed down for 3 generations without question. It worked for a specific window of history that has now closed. What you are about to hear is not an argument against saving. It is a diagnosis. Until you see the structure of the problem clearly, every solution you try will land wrong. The advice you inherited was designed for a different economy, a different era, and a different set of rules. That advice has a cost. By the end of this chapter, you will be able to name that cost precisely. The last chapter handed you a question and it is still in the room. What would it cost you in specific and concrete terms to wait one more year? Hold that question. It matters more than it seems right now, and the answer will sharpen as this chapter moves forward. Here is where most people think the problem starts. They think it starts with income. They earn too little, they say. They think the gap between where they are and where they want to be is a math problem, a numbers problem, a paycheck problem. If that were true, a raise would fix it. A second job would fix it. A promotion would fix it. But you have seen people get all three of those things and still find themselves in the same financial position 5 years later. The problem is not the size of the number coming in. The problem is the instruction set attached to that number. Meet Marcus. Marcus is 34 years old. He works in logistics management for a regional freight company in Columbus, Ohio. He earns $62,000 a year, more than either of his parents ever made in their best years. His mother cleaned offices for 20 years and saved every spare dollar in a savings account that paid 0.4% interest. His father drove a delivery truck and put money into a 401k only when his employer matched it, stopping contributions the moment the match ended. Both of his parents retired without debt. Both of them also retired without enough. Marcus watched that. He absorbed it as the model, so Marcus does what they taught him. He contributes to his 401k up to the match. He has a savings account he does not touch. He avoids credit card debt. He drives a car he owns outright. By every measure his parents would recognize, Marcus is doing everything right. But Marcus is 34. The wealth gap between people who started positioning assets in 2015 and people who start in 2026 is not a small gap. It is a structural chasm. And Marcus does not know this, because no one around him was playing the positioning game. No one around him was talking about assets at 25. They were talking about stability, about security, about not losing what little you had. Marcus is not behind because he is lazy. He is behind because the people who loved him most could only teach him what they knew, and what they knew was survival. Remember your actual circumstances 3 years earlier, not emotionally, specifically. What did your bank account look like? What did you think money was for? How many conversations had you ever had with someone actively building wealth, not describing it, not dreaming about it, but executing a specific plan with a specific timeline? For most people in their 20s and early 30s from working-class households, the answer is close to zero. That silence is not neutral. That silence is a starting line moved back by a decade. The advice passed down through working-class families was not wrong for the world it came from. Your parents or grandparents lived through conditions where losing what you had was the primary risk. Savings accounts existed to protect against collapse. Avoiding debt was rational when debt could spiral without warning. Working overtime was the only lever most people had access to. These were not failures of intelligence. They were perfectly calibrated responses to a specific set of circumstances. But circumstances changed. The levers changed, and the advice did not. Here is what survival advice teaches you. It teaches you to protect the dollar you have. It teaches you that risk is the enemy, that volatility is dangerous, that steady and slow is how you stay afloat. Every one of those instincts is correct if your primary goal is not drowning. But not drowning and building something are not the same activity. They require different muscles, different decisions, and different timing. This is the structural trap. Survival advice in an accumulation game does not just underperform. It actively works against you. While you are protecting the dollar you have, People with accumulation knowledge are deploying dollars to acquire assets that produce more dollars. The gap between those two approaches compounds. Every year you spend in protection mode while others are in accumulation mode. The distance grows not linearly, but exponentially. Marcus knows about compound interest. His mother explained it when he was 16, sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator, showing him how a saved dollar grows over time. She was right about the principle. What she did not know and could not have told him was that the assets doing the most compounding were not sitting in savings accounts. They were in index funds, in real estate with leverage, in private equity, in equity stakes in businesses. The compounding she showed him was real. The vehicle she pointed him toward was the slowest one in the race. No one is to blame for this. That is important to say clearly. The knowledge gap is not a moral failure. It is a structural inheritance. First-generation wealth builders do not start behind because their families were not smart. They start behind because the information required to play the accumulation game was never part of their household's operating knowledge. It circulated in different rooms, different schools, different dinner tables. And here is where timing enters. The accumulation game has on-ramps, specific, time-sensitive on-ramps. There are moments when conditions align to make certain moves significantly more accessible, when asset prices create entry points, when regulatory structures favor new participants, when economic shifts redistribute opportunity before it reconcentrates. 2026 is one of those moments, not because of magic. Because of math and structure and the specific convergence of economic forces the first chapter laid out. That window does not stay open. Marcus is still sitting at a desk in Columbus, contributing enough to his 401k to capture the match, watching his savings account grow by a few $100s a month, waiting for the right time to do something more. The right time, in his mind, is when he has more information, more capital, more certainty. This is the final symptom of survival thinking. Waiting for certainty before acting is rational when the cost of a wrong move is losing what keeps you fed. In an accumulation context, waiting is itself the wrong move. Every month of waiting is a month of compounding given away. Here is the open loop this chapter started with, and now it closes. What would it cost you to wait one more year? The answer is not a feeling. It is a number. If you wait and do nothing, you lose compounding time. You lose entry point access. You lose the specific advantage that first-generation builders carry, the willingness to act without the fear of losing a family legacy, because there is no legacy yet to protect. That edge expires. Not because you age out of it. Because the window that makes the edge valuable closes and the math behind it changes. The diagnosis is this. You were taught to hold on. The world you need to build in requires you to reach out. Holding on and reaching out use the same hand but in opposite directions. You cannot do both at once. Down the line in this book, we turn toward an argument about risk that clashes with the familiar story. When that idea snaps into focus, it changes how you decide when to move. Marcus went home that night and sat with a question he had never quite framed this way before. Not how do I save more? Not how do I earn more? He sat with this. What is the difference between what I am doing with money and what people with more money than me are doing with money? Not the amount, the behavior, the structure, the sequence. That question is the right question, and it is the question this chapter was built to hand you. What did the people who arrived before you already know that you are only now beginning to name? Chapter 3. Wealth is built in windows, not decades. Saving money for 30 years is one of the least reliable ways to build wealth. That sounds like advice from someone who wants you to stop being responsible. It is not. It is an observation about how wealth actually accumulates in the real world, as opposed to how financial advice books tell you it does. The people who arrived before you, the ones you read about at the start of this book, the ones who seemed to build something out of nothing in a short span of time, they were not more disciplined than you. They were better positioned. And positioning is not random. It follows a pattern. Once you see that pattern, you will stop measuring your effort in years and start measuring it in windows. The question at the center of this chapter is this for now, and it will not be answered right away. Why do two people with identical incomes, identical habits, and identical work ethic end up with wildly different financial outcomes 15 years later? Hold that question. The answer is not what most people assume it is, and it will change how you think about everything you do between now and 2026. Look back at the version of you waking up each morning 3 years earlier. Not in vague terms, but specifically. What were you earning? What did you own? What did you believe was possible for you? Now think about someone you know, roughly your age, who is now in noticeably better financial shape than you are. Did they work harder? In most cases, no. Did they earn significantly more? Sometimes, but often not enough to explain the gap. What they likely did was stumble into a high-leverage window and do something inside it. They bought property when it was cheap and rising. They joined a company before a valuation spike. They launched something small when entry costs were low and demand was surging. They did not plan it perfectly, but they acted when the window was open, and now the window is closed behind them. That is not luck. It is timing. And timing, unlike talent, can be studied. Here is what you need to understand about how wealth actually accumulates. It does not move in a straight line. It moves in pulses. Decades of financial history show the same recurring pattern. From the post-war housing boom in the late 1940s to the internet infrastructure build-out in the late 1990s to the mobile app economy that crystallized around 2010, the shape is always the same. A window opens. Structural conditions align. Entry costs are low, upside is high, and most people are either unaware or hesitant. A relatively small number of people act. Then the window closes. For the next decade, everyone else watches those people compound what they captured inside that window, while the outside world returns to slow, incremental movement. The decade of steady effort that financial advice tells you to execute is real. But what it does not tell you is that most of the gain from that decade was earned in a concentrated burst at the beginning, when conditions were leveraged. The rest of the decade is maintenance. It is protection. It is not creation. Stop for a moment and let that land, because it is not a motivational idea. It is a structural one. Marcus was 31 years old when he started driving for a rideshare company on weekends. He had a day job, a modest savings account, and a clear-eyed view of what both were doing for him, which was not much. A coworker mentioned in passing that one specific city district had been rezoned for mixed-use development, and that small multi-unit properties in that district were still priced, as though the rezoning had not happened yet. Marcus did not know anything about real estate. He knew one person who did, a woman named Dolores who had done one deal 5 years earlier and still talked about it at every neighborhood gathering. He took Dolores to coffee. She walked him through how she had done it. She told him plainly that the window she had used was already closed, but that the rezoning situation sounded different. Marcus spent 4 months saving aggressively, got his finances organized, and purchased a small duplex inside that district. 18 months later, 2 national developers announced projects within 3 blocks of his building. The property value moved sharply. The rental income more than covered his costs. He did not get rich overnight, but he captured something inside a window that is now firmly shut. He drives less on weekends. He talks the way Delors used to talk. The principle he acted on was not genius. It was timing, applied specifically on purpose. Notice what Marcus did not do. He did not spend years studying real estate theory. He did not wait until he felt fully prepared. He identified a window, found someone who could compress his learning curve, and moved before the structural advantage disappeared. That is the entire formula. And it works whether the window involves property or digital infrastructure, or a specific professional skill that is about to become scarce and expensive, or a small business category that a generation of retiring owners is about to vacate. The wealthy do not work harder during good times. They work differently during specific windows, and they rest when the leverage disappears. Read that again, not as inspiration, but as instruction. It means 2 things simultaneously. First, there are periods when your effort multiplies because structural conditions are doing most of the heavy lifting. Second, there are periods when effort alone produces only proportional returns, and grinding through those periods with maximum intensity is how people burn out without building anything. Most people do the opposite. They grind at full speed during low-leverage periods out of guilt or fear, and they hesitate during high-leverage windows because those windows look unfamiliar, risky, and inconvenient. The window asks you to move in a new direction. The low-leverage period asks you to do what you already know how to do, just more of it. Familiarity wins every time, unless you have a framework for recognizing what a window actually looks like. Here is that framework. A high-leverage window has 3 visible features. Entry costs are currently low relative to what they will be. Demand for the thing inside the window is rising but has not yet been fully priced in. And the structural conditions creating the window have a visible end point, a policy change, a demographic shift, a technology inflection, a regulatory deadline, something that tells you this will not stay open indefinitely. When all 3 of those features are present at the same time, you are standing at a window. When only 1 or 2 are present, you are standing at an interesting opportunity, but not a structural one. Apply this to your own situation right now. What around you currently has low entry costs? What demand is rising but not yet fully reflected in price? And what structural force is going to close this eventually? You do not need perfect answers. You need directional ones. A little later, you will hear a point about playing it safe during uncertain economic periods that clashes with the familiar story. Once that lands, it shifts how you act in the next 12 months. Now back to the question this chapter opened with. 2 people, identical income, identical habits, identical discipline. Wildly different outcomes 15 years later. The answer is this. One of them entered a high-leverage window at some point in the first 5 years. Not because they were smarter, not because they had better information, but because they had a framework, even a loose, instinctive one, that told them conditions were different right now than they usually are, and that right now was the moment to act at higher intensity than usual. The other person saved steadily, invested regularly, made sensible decisions, and got sensible returns. Nothing wrong with any of it, but sensible returns over 15 years do not close a wealth gap that was opened by a single window someone else walked through in year 3. This is why the delayed start myth is so costly. Not because starting late means you have less time. It is worse than that. Starting late means you keep missing windows while telling yourself there will be another one later. And there will be. But the windows available to first-generation builders, the ones that require less existing capital and more positioned effort, those windows do not stay open for decades. They open in specific economic moments and they close. The one in front of you right now is not metaphorical. The digital infrastructure consolidation, the commercial real estate repricing, the professional skills shortage in specific sectors, the first real wave of small business succession from retiring baby boomers, all of those have visible endpoints. You can feel it if you stop moving for a second and just pay attention to what is changing around you. Something is different. The texture of opportunity is different than it was 5 years ago, and it will be different again 5 years from now. The question is whether you are using a framework to read it, or whether you are waiting for it to feel safe enough. The first-generation edge is this. You do not have inherited positions to protect. You have nothing to lose from acting inside a window that existing wealth holders are too cautious to enter. Every major wealth-building wave in modern history had its early participants who came from nothing, and those participants shared one trait, not courage in the abstract, specific action inside a specific window before the window was obvious to everyone. The people who arrived before you knew that wealth is not built across decades. It is captured in windows. The decade is just what comes after when you protect and compound what you took from the window while it was open. You are not behind. You are at a window that is still open. The only question that matters now is this: what exactly are you going to carry through it? Chapter 4. The asset classes they accumulate while you sleep. Something is leaving your hands right now, not dramatically, not in one visible moment you can point to later and say, that was it, that was when it happened. It is leaving quietly in the ordinary hours of an ordinary week. The way water leaves a cracked glass, not in a pour, but in a slow, persistent vanishing. The money you earn this month is not simply this month's income. It is the asset it could have become. It is the position it could have opened. It is the stake in something that would have grown while you slept. And it is converting, right now, into expenses and time past and nothing that compounds. The mechanism behind this is not bad luck. It is not your character. It is simply that no one handed you a map of what the wealthy actually accumulate. They handed you a description of how hard they worked. That is not the same thing. This chapter is the map. You heard the question at the end of the last chapter. What exactly are you going to carry through it? Through the window that is still, for now, open. The answer starts here, with 3 specific things you can begin accumulating in 2026. 3 things that do not require a wealthy parent, a seed investor, or a network built over decades. 3 asset classes that a structural shift in the economy has made temporarily available to people who are starting with nothing but time, attention, and a device connected to the internet. But before we name them, there is something you need to understand about why most people never reach them at all. Here is the open question this chapter is going to hold for you. Why do people who understand that wealth comes from assets, who have read the books, heard the podcasts, nodded along to all of it, still end up with nothing but income at the end of each year? They know the theory. They believe it. And yet the asset column stays empty. That question will feel obvious soon. But the answer is not what you expect. Return to the version of you waking up each morning 3 years earlier. Think about what you were earning then and what you are earning now. Has the gap between those 2 numbers changed your relationship to financial stress? Or is the stress simply wearing a higher price tag? For most people listening to this, the income grew and the breathing room did not. That is not a coincidence. That is the structure working exactly as designed. Income that flows directly into consumption does not accumulate. It circulates. And circulation is not the same as ownership. The wealthy understood something generations ago that most first-generation earners are only beginning to absorb now. The goal is never to earn more. The goal is to own more. Earning is a faucet. Ownership is a reservoir. And for most of the last century, building a reservoir required an existing reservoir to start from. You needed capital to enter the asset classes that compound. You needed property to leverage into more property. You needed a brokerage account with enough in it to matter. The barrier was real. It was not imagined. That barrier has cracked, not collapsed entirely, but cracked in 3 specific places that 2026 still makes accessible. The years after 2026 will very likely close or restructure those places as institutions notice and respond. This is the structural timing that runs through everything in this book. The window is not metaphor. It is a documented pattern of how emerging asset classes move from open access to gate-kept, as capital concentrates in them, and the early adopters become the new gatekeepers. The first crack is digital leverage. Marcus was 29 and worked as a logistics coordinator for a mid-size freight company in Cincinnati. He earned a salary that paid his rent and his car, and left him about $240 a month after necessities. He had no investors, no savings to speak of, and no technical skills beyond the software his employer trained him on. What he had was a specific and operational knowledge of how freight procurement worked, the inefficiencies, the pricing gaps, the relationships between carriers that most people outside the industry never see. That knowledge lived entirely in his head. It had never been written down, and for years it earned him only his salary. In 2023, Marcus spent 11 weeks converting that knowledge into a structured online course. Not a polished production, a screen recording, a USB microphone, and a course platform that charged no upfront fee and took a percentage of sales. He priced it at $97 and sold it to freight professionals who needed what he knew. By month 4, that course was generating more than his car payment every month without additional hours from him. By the end of the first year, it had generated over $19,000 on top of his salary. He had not quit his job. He had not taken a risk with money he did not have. He had converted knowledge he already owned into an asset that produced income independent of his time. That is digital leverage, not content creation as a vague aspiration. The precise act of packaging expertise, operational, vocational, experiential, into a form that sells once and delivers repeatedly. Let one beat pass with that before moving forward. The reason digital leverage matters in 2026 specifically is that the infrastructure supporting it has reached a maturity point where creation and distribution costs are near zero. Meanwhile, the market for specialized knowledge has never been larger. Platforms exist that host, sell, and deliver your product without requiring you to build or own the platform itself. The capital requirement is time. And time, right now, is the one resource that first-generation builders have that inherited wealth builders frequently waste. The irony of the current moment is that the people with the most immediately useful knowledge, tradespeople, coordinators, case managers, technicians, small business operators, are the people least likely to understand that knowledge is a monetizable asset. It is sitting there, unconverted, every single day. The second crack is attention monetization. This one gets dismissed fastest because it gets confused with influencing. Forget influencing. That is a personality business. It requires a specific kind of audience and a specific kind of person. Attention monetization, the version that matters here, is narrower and more durable. It is the practice of owning an audience in a specific niche where purchase decisions are made. Not millions of followers. A specific few thousand people who trust your curation. A newsletter about a local real estate market. A YouTube channel that reviews tools in a specific trade. A community forum that helps a narrow professional category solve a recurring problem. When that audience exists and trusts the person who built it, the attention they give becomes an asset. One that can generate affiliate revenue, sponsorship income, or direct product sales completely independent of employment. What makes this an asset class and not just a side hustle is ownership. You do not own your job. You do not own your salary. You own an audience you built. Platforms can reduce your reach. They cannot remove your relationship with the people who chose to follow you. An email list of 3,000 engaged subscribers in the right niche is a more durable income-producing asset than most certificates on a wall. And the cost of building it in 2026 is still primarily time and consistency, not capital. Here is the part most people miss. The window on this one is narrowing. AI is now generating enormous volumes of generic content, and that is training audiences to seek the specific, the human, and the personally credible. The moment for faceless generic content has already passed, but the moment for precise niche expertise delivered with a genuine human perspective is still open. That window is not 10 years wide. It is probably 3. The third crack is fractional ownership. This is the one that sounds like a loophole. For most of financial history, it essentially was unavailable to ordinary people. Real estate investment trusts have existed since the 1960s. But the newer fractional platforms, those that allow you to own a share of individual properties, private credit instruments, or early-stage business equity for minimums as low as $10 or $20, represent something structurally new. The minimum viable entry to asset ownership has dropped below the psychological threshold of risk for most people. You are not betting your savings. You are not exposed to catastrophic loss. You are planting a stake in an appreciating category with an amount small enough to feel like an experiment. The compounding effect is not dramatic in the first year. It is not meant to be. What fractional ownership does in the early stage is not primarily financial. It restructures how you think. The moment you own a fraction of a real asset, even a $10 stake in a real estate syndication, you begin to see the world the way asset owners see it. You notice interest rates differently. You read economic news differently. You start doing the math on appreciation instead of just the math on income. That cognitive shift is worth more in the long run than the $10 ever will be in isolation, because it is the beginning of an ownership orientation that most first-generation earners never develop until it is too late to compound. Now go back to the open question. Why do people who know that wealth comes from assets still end up with nothing but income? The answer is not ignorance. It is not laziness. It is sequencing. They wait until they feel ready. They wait for the right amount. They wait until they have cleared the current debt, finished the current season, made it through the current hard stretch. And the waiting is so ordinary, so reasonable feeling, so perfectly justified in every individual instance, that they never feel like they are making a choice at all. But every week of waiting is a week the asset does not compound. Every year spent inside income-only thinking is a year the gap widens. Not because the people ahead are smarter or harder working, but because their assets were running while you were still preparing to start. Digital leverage, attention monetization, fractional ownership, 3 entry points that do not require a wealthy beginning. 3 cracks in a wall that has kept first-generation builders out of the asset column for generations. The wall will not stay cracked. The question is not whether you are ready. The question is what you are going to do before the wall repairs itself. Chapter 5. Information asymmetry is the only real moat left. Knowing first is worth more than working harder. That sounds like advice designed to make laziness feel sophisticated. You are right to be suspicious of it, but this is not a claim about effort. It is a claim about leverage. And once you see how leverage actually works inside the wealth gap, the advice to simply work harder will start to feel like something someone designed specifically to keep you running in place. Here is the question that should be living in your mind right now. What is the most valuable financial insight you currently hold, and where exactly did you get it? Hold that question. Do not answer it yet. The answer will mean something very specific by the time you reach the end of this chapter. Answer it too early and you will miss the weight of it. The previous chapter closed on a wall and what you do before it repairs itself. The wall is structural. It is not personal. But what determines whether you move before it closes is almost never courage or work ethic or even access to capital at the beginning. What determines it, almost entirely, is whether you knew the wall was there before the majority of people were informed it existed. Speed is downstream of information. Every other advantage you can name, money, connections, credentials, those are downstream of information too. They accumulate where information flowed first. Think about the last time you learned something genuinely useful about money. Not a tip, not a headline. Something that actually changed how you made a decision. How long ago was that? Most people, when they are honest, realize their functional financial knowledge has not meaningfully updated in 2, 3, sometimes 5 years. They are operating on the same mental map while the territory has been redrawn 3 times over. That gap between your map and the actual terrain is not neutral. It is costing you something specific and compounding. Here is what information asymmetry means in plain language. At any given moment, some people know something that most people do not. The thing they know is not a secret in the conspiratorial sense. It is not locked away. It is available, technically, to anyone who looks in the right places, in the right order, at the right time. But in practice, a very small number of people encounter it early, act on it early, and capture the bulk of the available return before the price of entry rises to match the now public awareness. By the time most people hear about the thing, its best moment has already passed. The asymmetry is not about secrecy. It is about timing and attention and the specific diet of information you consume every single day. Marcus was 29 years old and working a procurement job at a mid-sized logistics company in Cincinnati. He was not exceptional by any standard that showed up on paper. He had a state school degree, about $8,000 saved, and no family members who owned anything more complex than a car. But Marcus had developed one precise habit. He read primary sources. Not blogs that cited news articles that summarized research. He read the actual research, not because he was disciplined in the self-improvement sense, but because a colleague once pointed out that every article he had ever read about a financial trend was already 2 years late by the time it ran in a mainstream publication. That comment lodged in Marcus like a splinter, so he started going upstream. He read Federal Reserve commentary directly. He read municipal budget filings for his city and 2 neighboring ones. He subscribed to 2 commercial real estate newsletters that had no advertising revenue and charged $120 a year. They were written by analysts for other analysts, not for a general audience trying to sell you a course. Within 14 months, Marcus identified a zoning reclassification in a neighborhood adjacent to his own. It had been approved at a city planning commission meeting attended by 11 people, covered by 0 journalists, and missed by every residential real estate agent he later spoke with. He bought a duplex there, not because he had some special genius, because he read something that 8,000 other people in his city could have read but did not. That duplex was not magic. But it was a different price in month 1 than it was in month 19, when the reclassification became common knowledge and 3 developers filed permits on the same block. Let one beat pass on that story before you move forward. The asset Marcus purchased did not change. The neighborhood did not change on the day he bought it. What changed was the information environment around it. Marcus was on the early side of that change instead of the late side. That is the entire mechanism. That is the whole thing. And it is available to you in a way that starting with more money or having a wealthy parent is not. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. Call to mind to the structure of your money life 3 years earlier. Think about the specific things you believe to be true about money, about wealth, about your own prospects. Now think about how many of those beliefs came from mainstream sources, from the financial content that gets the most clicks, the most shares, the most podcast downloads, the most followers. Ask yourself honestly, did any of that content ever tell you something genuinely early? Did it give you an insight that, when you acted on it, returned something meaningful before the crowd arrived? Most mainstream financial content is not designed to make you wealthy. It is designed to make you feel informed while remaining comfortable. There is a difference between those two outcomes. The business model of almost every high-distribution financial media platform depends on you not noticing that difference. When something is designed for maximum audience reach, it must, by definition, wait. It waits until the insight has become safe enough for a mass audience, safe from alienating sponsors, safe from legal risk, safe from the discomfort of being genuinely early and therefore uncertain. By the time a financial insight is polished enough to run on a platform built for scale, its edge has been sanded off. You are consuming the official story of something that already happened. This is the voluntary surrender that most people never notice they are making. You have a limited number of hours each week that you can realistically spend consuming financial information. The choice you make about where to spend those hours determines not just what you know, but when you know it. In the current compression window, when specific changes in tax policy, in small-scale commercial lending, in specific asset classes that remain below the attention threshold of institutional capital, are still creating early mover returns, the timing gap between knowing and not knowing is measured in months, not decades. You do not have the time to spend 3 hours a week consuming content that confirms what everyone already knows. The sources that accelerate financial literacy share a small number of traits. They are written by practitioners, not explainers. They cover mechanisms, not narratives. They are hard to find because they are not optimized for discovery. They require you to already understand something in order to understand what they are saying. That means they are gatekept not by money or credentials, but by prior knowledge. And they are boring in the way that precise things are always boring to people who want to be entertained. A municipal bond offering circular is not compelling reading. But if you understand why the terms of that circular matter and what they signal about a city's fiscal trajectory, you now hold a piece of information that almost nobody in your income bracket holds. That is a moat. not a metaphorical one. The closing window from this book's opening chapter is not just about market timing. It is about information flow. The window that closes is partly structural, yes, but it also closes because information that was once obscure becomes mainstream. And once it becomes mainstream, the price of every asset connected to that information adjusts upward to reflect the now public awareness. The closing of the window and the commodification of the insight are the same event, described from two different angles. There is one more layer here that most people miss entirely. The first-generation builder, the person without inherited capital or established networks, has one compensatory advantage that is rarely named plainly. That person has no received wisdom to unlearn. The second or third generation heir who wants to build independently carries a library of assumptions, passed down through family dinner conversations, through the particular way their parents talked about money, through the asset classes and strategies that were treated as obvious in their household. Those assumptions are invisible precisely because they feel like common sense. Unlearning them takes longer than you would expect and costs real money along the way. You have no such library. You are starting with a blank ledger on that specific dimension. When you encounter a genuine insight, something that does not fit into a pre-existing family framework, you have no inherited resistance to it. You can simply evaluate it on its merits and act. That is a structural advantage disguised as a disadvantage. It is available right now, in this specific window, before the information ecosystem consolidates further, and the early mover returns in the asset classes that remain accessible at your capital level begin to normalize downward. Further on, you will hear a point about patience as a wealth-building virtue that clashes with the familiar story. When that becomes clear, it shifts how you decide when to act on what you know. But for now, return to the question this chapter opened with. What is the most valuable financial insight you currently hold, and where did you get it? If the honest answer traces back to a platform built for scale and maximum reach, you do not have a knowledge problem. You have a source problem. And source problems are the one category of problem you can fix by tomorrow morning. The last free resource in a world where capital compounds toward capital is knowing first. The question is whether you are feeding your attention to the sources that keep you just informed enough to feel current, or the ones that put you one uncomfortable, boring, specific step ahead. Chapter 6. Why Saving Money is Losing the Wealth Game. Something is quietly leaking out of your life while you stay busy. It has nothing to do with your spending habits. It is not the coffee, not the subscription you forgot to cancel, not the dinner you put on a card last weekend. The drain is quieter than any of those things. It is happening inside the account you are most proud of. The one you built carefully, the one you check sometimes just to feel better about where you stand. That savings account, the one that represents discipline and sacrifice and delayed gratification, is losing ground every single month. Not because you are doing it wrong, because the rules of the game were written before you arrived, and nobody explained that saving is not the same thing as building. The difference between those two words is the difference between running in place and actually moving. And the longer you do not see that distinction clearly, the more expensive that invisible gap becomes. This chapter is about that gap. By the time you reach the end of it, the way you think about money sitting still will be fundamentally changed. That one uncomfortable, boring, specific step ahead, the one the previous chapter put in your hands, it almost always feels like information you are not supposed to have. Not because it is secret, because it contradicts what everyone around you was taught to believe. And the belief most worth contradicting right now is this: that saving money is a wealth-building strategy. It is not. It is a loss mitigation strategy. And for first-generation builders standing at the edge of a closing window, loss mitigation is not enough. Here is the question that will stay open for a moment before this chapter answers it. If two people start with the exact same $10,000 on the same January morning, and one of them saves it while the other deploys it, how far apart are they 5 years later, and in which direction? Hold that question. The answer is not what you expect. Picture the version of you waking up each morning 3 years earlier. Not emotionally, financially. Think about what you had in your account, what you owed, what you believed was possible, and what you were waiting to begin. Most people, when they do this honestly, realize that 3 years ago they were also waiting. Waiting to feel ready. Waiting for the number in the account to feel large enough. Waiting for some internal signal that it was safe to move. And now, 3 years later, the waiting has continued. Except the price of the thing they were waiting to enter, whether that is property, an index fund, a private equity stake, a piece of digital infrastructure, that price is different, usually higher. The wait did not protect them. It cost them. This is not an accident. It is the structure of the system. There is a word that gets used very carefully in financial circles. That word is inflation. People hear it and think about groceries. They think about gas prices and rent going up and shaking their heads at the news. But inflation is not primarily a consumer problem. It is a savings problem. Inflation is the rate at which the purchasing power of the money you have already earned, already saved, already protected, quietly decreases. Every year your savings account earns 2%, and inflation runs at 3.5%. You have not earned anything. You have lost 1.5% of real value while feeling like you played it safe. The feeling and the reality are pointing in opposite directions. And while your savings erode at that rate, something else is happening. Assets are appreciating. Not all assets. Not always. Not in a straight line. But the long-term direction of income-producing assets, real estate, broad equity markets, certain infrastructure investments, has been consistently upward for decades, even with every crash and correction accounted for. The distance between what savings earns and what assets earn over time is not a small distance. It is the structural engine of the wealth gap. And most first-generation builders are on the wrong side of that engine, not because they are undisciplined, but because they were handed a map that only showed them the savings lane. Let's make this specific. 2 people, $10,000 each. Same starting line, January 1st. The first person does exactly what they were taught. They deposit that $10,000 into a high-yield savings account earning 4% annually, which is generous by most standards. At the end of 5 years, they have roughly $12,200. They feel good. The money grew. They did the responsible thing. The second person splits that $10,000 3 ways. $3,000 goes into a broad market index fund, with a historical average return of roughly 9 to 10% annually. $4,000 goes as a down payment contribution toward a small income-producing property through a partnership, where the asset appreciates at the national average for residential real estate, which has hovered near 6 to 7% annually over long periods, while also generating modest rental income. The remaining $3,000 goes into a small position in infrastructure-adjacent assets, things like REITs or sector ETFs, with a 5-year average of around 7%. None of these are exotic. None of these require a financial advisor or a private network. All of them are legally accessible to someone with $10,000 and a willingness to learn one uncomfortable, boring, specific thing. At the end of 5 years, the deployed 10,000 has not become 12,200. It is somewhere between 17,000 and 19,000, depending on the market period, the reinvestment strategy, and the specific assets chosen. The spread between those two outcomes is not $5,000. It is everything. Because that $5,000 difference, compounded forward over the next 10 years, is not $5,000. It is the difference in net worth between two people who started in identical positions. That is the game, and saving money is not playing it. Here is where first-generation builders face a specific kind of pressure that most financial advice does not account for. When you are the first person in your family to have real savings, those savings feel like survival money, not investment money. Every dollar in that account represents something you would not have had in a crisis 5 years ago. It represents the version of you that does not have to ask anyone for help. It represents safety in a way that is not theoretical. It is emotional. It is historical. It is legitimate. Letting go of that feeling, or more precisely, letting go of the idea that money sitting still equals security, is one of the hardest internal shifts a first-generation builder has to make. But it is necessary, because security does not come from money that is standing still. Security comes from money that is moving in the right direction. There is a parable that lives in a small town in Pennsylvania, not famous, not written up anywhere. Just passed between people who knew a man named Desmond Reeves. Desmond worked 31 years at the same manufacturing plant outside of Allentown, not because he lacked ambition, but because the job paid steady and he valued steady. Every raise he got, he saved. Every bonus he saved. By the time he was 54, Desmond had $90,000 in a savings account, a paid-off car, and no debt. People in his neighborhood thought he was the most financially responsible man they knew. He thought so too. What Desmond did not know was that a house 2 streets over had sold for $82,000 the year he started his job. By the time he reached his mid-50s, that house was worth $340,000. He had walked past it 1,000 times. He had the money to have bought it or something like it several times over during those 31 years. But he was saving, he was being careful, he was doing what he was taught. Desmond is not a cautionary tale about failure. He is a cautionary tale about a correct action applied to an incomplete understanding of how wealth actually moves. The house did not wait for Desmond to feel ready. Assets do not wait. That is the thing about windows. They do not stay open while you build up the courage to climb through. The first-generation edge, and it is a real edge, not a consolation prize, is the capacity to move with urgency that people who grew up comfortable do not always possess. They can afford to wait. You cannot. Not in a market where the window is narrowing year by year, as institutional buyers, algorithmic investment strategies, and capital consolidation at the top end of the distribution continue to absorb the entry-level asset positions that used to be accessible to individual builders. Soon, you will hear a point about risk that clashes with the familiar story. After that clicks, it shifts every financial decision you make from that point forward. But for now, close the open loop. Back to those 2 people on the same January morning. 5 years later, they are not equally wealthy. They are not even in the same conversation. And the one who saved, who did nothing wrong, who was disciplined and patient and responsible by every measure society handed them, is further behind than they were on that January morning, relative to the person who deployed. Not because deploying is always correct, Not because saving is always wrong, but because saving as a primary strategy inside a system designed to inflate currency and appreciate assets simultaneously is organized retreat. You are moving backward while staying in place. Saving is the preparation for building. It is not the building itself. The discipline to accumulate $1,000 or $10,000 or $50,000 matters. That discipline is real and necessary and hard-earned. But the moment you have accumulated enough to deploy, the moment you have even a modest position to place in a direction that beats inflation, that is the moment to move. Not to spend, not to comfort yourself with a purchase. To move. To put that money somewhere that the rules of the economic system, the same rules that have been eroding your savings quietly every month, now work for you instead of against you. You have been playing defense with an asset that demands you play offense. The window that this book keeps returning to is not a metaphor for vague urgency. It is a specific structural claim. The entry points for first-generation builders into income-producing asset classes are narrowing at a measurable rate, driven by capital concentration and regulatory environments that tend to favor existing asset holders. Saving your way to the starting line of that race is not a plan. It is the delay that the wealth gap depends on to sustain itself. So here is the question that will carry you into the next chapter. If saving is the trap, what is the threshold, the specific minimum position, that turns preparation into participation? Chapter 7. The network premium nobody tells you about. Saving money harder will not close the wealth gap. You already knew that on some level, even if you kept acting otherwise. It sounds like an excuse people make when they don't want to cut back. And that suspicion is exactly why most people dismiss this idea before they've really sat with it. But here is what the data keeps showing. Your financial outcomes are not primarily a function of your discipline. They are a function of your proximity. The people around you, the rooms you are in or absent from, the conversations that reach you or never reach you, these are doing more arithmetic on your net worth than any spreadsheet you have ever built. The reason this idea gets ignored is not because it is subtle. It is because it is inconvenient. Changing your savings rate is something you can do alone at midnight without telling anyone. Changing who you are close to is harder, slower, and more personal. So most people choose the spreadsheet, and then they wonder why the numbers don't change. The previous chapter ended with a question worth repeating. If saving is the trap, what is the threshold, the specific minimum position that turns preparation into participation? That question will get its full answer. But first you need to understand something that sits beneath it. The threshold is a door, but proximity is the key. An unresolved question is carrying this chapter forward until the argument catches up with it. There is a specific mechanism, not a vague idea about networking, but an actual economic mechanism. That explains why two people with identical incomes, identical savings rates, and identical financial knowledge can end up with dramatically different net worths over a decade. Researchers have measured it. You are going to understand exactly what that mechanism is before this chapter ends. Once you do, you will not be able to look at your current social environment the same way. Revisit the version of you waking up each morning 3 years earlier. Not your bank account, not your job title. Think about the conversations you were inside of every week. What were the people closest to you talking about when the conversation turned to money? Were they comparing prices? Were they talking about what they were building, what they were buying, what they were watching for? Were they frustrated the same way you were frustrated? Or were any of them living in a different financial reality, one that pulled you forward just by proximity? Sit with that for a moment, because the answer to that question explains more about where you are right now than any choice you made alone. The economic term for what we are talking about is information asymmetry. But that phrase makes it sound clinical, distant, like something that happens to other people in textbooks. What it actually means in practice in your life is this: there are deals, opportunities, investments, and market moments that never reach most people through any public channel. They do not appear in apps. They are not on financial news. They are not in any article you will find by searching. They move person to person through trust, through relationship, through the quiet economy of who knows who. And right now, in the specific economic window between late 2024 and 2026, this quiet economy is operating faster and more consequentially than it has in at least a generation. The window is still open, but the gap between those inside the conversation and those outside it is widening. Let me tell you about 𝗓𝗧𝗧𝗓𝗧. 𝗓𝗧𝗧 was 29 when she took a lateral move that looked, on paper, like a mistake. She left a stable marketing position at a mid-sized company for a slightly lower salary at a smaller firm. Her family thought she had lost perspective. Her old colleagues felt sorry for her. But 𝗓𝗧𝗧𝗓𝗧 had noticed something. The founder of that smaller firm talked about money differently. Not recklessly, not in an abstract aspirational way, but with a specificity that signaled actual experience. He would mention, in passing, the mechanics of deals she had never heard discussed. He introduced her, without any fanfare, to two other people who operated the same way. 6 months later, one of those people mentioned a private real estate syndication over a casual lunch. It was opening to a small group of investors. The minimum was $8,000. 𝗓𝗧𝗧𝗓𝗧 had 9,000 saved. She asked 3 careful questions. She did 2 weeks of research she now knew how to do because of the conversations she had been inside of, and she committed. The return over the following 18 months was not the point, though the return was real and significant. The point was the door it opened. She was now inside a different layer of conversation, one that moved faster, carried better information, and operated on trust she had earned through proximity, not credentials. 𝗓𝗧𝗧𝗓𝗧 did not find that opportunity through discipline. She found it through a single deliberate shift in who was close to her. Now here is what she understood that most people don't. She was not looking for a mentor. She was not trying to exploit a relationship. She was repositioning herself inside a different information environment, one where the signals about what to do with money were simply better, richer, more specific, more actionable. Your net worth is not just your decisions. It is the weighted average of the financial behaviors you are closest to. That is the revelation this chapter has been building toward. It deserves a moment to land. When researchers at Harvard and the Federal Reserve independently studied wealth accumulation across income groups, they found that peer financial behavior was among the most powerful predictors of individual financial outcomes. More powerful than income level alone. More powerful than formal financial education. More powerful than access to certain products or accounts. The mechanism is this. The people closest to you set your baseline sense of what is normal, what is worth doing, what risk is acceptable, what return is worth pursuing. You absorb their financial logic through conversation, observation, and the invisible modeling of behavior that happens without any formal instruction. This is not about copying people. It is about calibration. Think of it this way. If everyone in your immediate circle treats a $10,000 savings account as an impressive and complete achievement, That is the waterline you will unconsciously build toward. Once you reach it, you will feel done. But if the people you regularly talk with treat 10,000 as an operating reserve and speak openly about the next layer of deployment, your internal sense of what constitutes progress recalibrates. Without anyone telling you what to do, your baseline shifts. That baseline shift is worth, over a decade, more than almost any tactical decision you could make. That is the mechanism. Not charm, not networking events, not collecting business cards. Baseline recalibration through sustained proximity. Now here is where first-generation builders face a specific structural disadvantage. This matters because this book is aimed squarely at you. If your parents were not investors, if your immediate family did not move in financial circles where private deals, equity conversations, and asset strategy were common topics, then you did not absorb this calibration growing up. You absorbed a different one, a careful one, an often survival-oriented one that taught you to protect what you have rather than deploy it. That calibration served the previous generation in the conditions they faced. But in 2025, in the specific window that is still open but closing, that calibration is costing you time you cannot buy back. The good news is that calibration is not fixed. It is environmental, and environments can be changed. This is exactly where the closing window becomes urgent in a new way. The people who are currently building wealth in this window are not guarding their circles jealously. Early stages of economic cycles create a different social dynamic than mature ones. In mature markets, access is defended, curated, protected. In transitional markets, like the one you are currently inside of, people with emerging financial momentum are actively looking for others who are sharp, curious, and positioned to act. The circles are more porous now than they will be in 3 years. That is not an accident. It is a structural feature of the moment. You can walk through doors right now that will require far more expensive credentials later. So what does this look like practically? Not abstractly, but in the actual decisions you make this week. Start by auditing your current proximity. Not to judge yourself, but to see clearly. Who are the 5 people you talk to most about money? Not who you wish you talked to, who you actually do. What is the financial waterline in those conversations? What do those people treat as normal? What do they treat as ambitious? Then ask honestly, is that waterline where you need it to be, or is it set lower than your actual potential requires? This audit will be uncomfortable. It is supposed to be. Comfort is expensive in this specific window. The next step is deliberate, low-friction repositioning. You do not need to abandon existing relationships. You need to add proximity to different ones. One new monthly conversation with someone operating at a different financial altitude does more calibration work than a year of books consumed in isolation. Because the books cannot give you the specific, present tense, real-world information that a human being in active financial motion can give you in 20 minutes. Priya changed one relationship, one lateral move, and the information environment she landed in was so different from her previous one that the gap between her trajectory and her peers began to widen almost immediately. Not because she was smarter, because she was hearing different things, normalizing different things, and therefore doing different things. That is the network premium, not the resume connection, not the favor economy. The premium is calibration, information flow, and the quiet normalization of financial behaviors that compound. Now we can close the loop that was opened near the start of this chapter. The 2 people with identical incomes, identical savings rates, and identical financial knowledge, but dramatically different outcomes over a decade. The difference was their information environment. One of them was inside a network where the next move was always visible before it became public. The other was always one cycle behind. The gap between them was not intelligence. It was not even timing exactly. It was proximity to better signals earlier. You now understand the mechanism, and understanding it changes what you notice, which changes what you do. Later on, you will hear a point about financial risk that clashes with the familiar story. Once you grasp that turn, it shifts how you calculate every decision that follows. But right now, carry this forward. The threshold that turns preparation into participation is not just a number. It is also a room. And the question the next chapter will answer is, how do you get into that room before the door price goes up? Chapter 8. Speed is the leverage the wealthy actually use. Right now, while you are weighing a decision, someone else is closing one. Not because they are smarter, not because they have better instincts, because they moved and you did not. Every window that exists in a market, every undervalued entry point, every interest rate dip, every partnership that opens briefly like a door in a hallway has a clock built into it. Most people never see that clock until it has already stopped. The loss is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply shows up later as a number you cannot explain. A difference between where you are and where you could have been, with no clear memory of the moment you let it pass. The invisible mechanism is not bad luck. It is not the economy. It is the gap between when you knew enough to act and when you finally permitted yourself to. That gap has a price. And in the markets and moments ahead of you, that price is rising. This chapter is about closing that gap, not someday, in the specific windows that are still open right now. A question came forward in the last chapter and it is still in the room. How do you get into the room before the door price goes up? That question lives in the right place because it assumes you are moving towards something. But there is a prior question almost no one asks. It is the one that determines whether you reach the room at all. Not what room do I want to enter, but how fast am I willing to move once I know the direction. Here is the open loop this chapter will answer before it ends. There is a specific pattern shared by nearly every first-generation wealth builder who crosses into durable financial stability inside a compressed timeline. It is not a secret strategy. It is not a hidden investment class. It is a behavioral pattern so ordinary that most people overlook it entirely. By the end of this chapter, you will see it clearly. And once you see it, every slow decision you have ever made will look different in retrospect. The wealthy do not have better information most of the time. That surprises people. We tend to imagine that the gap between wealth and non-wealth is a gap in knowledge. The assumption runs something like this. If you only knew what they knew, you would do what they do. But the research on how high net worth individuals actually make financial decisions tells a different story. The primary structural advantage is not access to exclusive data. It is decision velocity. They move on qualifying opportunities within days, sometimes within hours. The average middle-income earner presented with the same opportunity deliberates for weeks and then often watches the window close. Call up the version of you waking up each morning 3 years earlier. Think about one opportunity you saw, a property, a business idea, a financial product, an invitation to partner with someone you respected and then did not move on. Not because you decided against it, because you kept meaning to circle back, because you wanted to do more research, because the timing felt slightly off. Now ask yourself, where would you be today if you had moved on it within 72 hours of first seeing it, not impulsively, not recklessly, but decisively with the information you already had? That is the mirror this chapter is holding up for a reason, not to create regret, to make the cost of deliberation visible before the next window opens. Deliberation is not the problem. Indefinite deliberation is. There is a critical difference between taking 3 days to make a sound decision and taking 3 months to make the same decision at worse terms. The wealthy understand this distinction viscerally. Many of them cannot explain it as a principle because they absorbed it as culture from parents, from mentors, from dinner table conversations about deals and timing. You may not have had those conversations. That is not a personal failure. It is a structural disadvantage, and structural disadvantages can be corrected the moment you name the mechanism causing them. The mechanism here is a belief. It operates quietly in the background of every financial decision you approach. It sounds like this: I will be more ready later. More capital, more knowledge, more confidence, more clarity. Later is when I will be truly prepared. This belief is the delayed start myth in one of its most effective disguises. It feels responsible. It feels intelligent. But in a market with closing windows, it functions identically to a decision not to act at all. Consider a woman named Priya. She was 31, working as a project manager, earning a decent salary, and carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has always done the right thing but has not yet seen it compound into anything visible. A colleague mentioned an opportunity, a fractional real estate platform offering early access terms to a select pool of small investors. The entry window was 30 days. Priya found the platform that same evening. She read everything available. She ran the numbers twice. She understood the risk profile. She thought it looked solid. And then she told herself she wanted to consult a financial advisor, review her emergency fund situation, and talk it over with her partner, who was traveling that week. 30 days became 60 days in her mind without her realizing it. By day 38, the early access terms had closed. The same platform was still available, but the fee structure had changed. The projected return on her intended investment had shifted by a margin that, compounded over 7 years, represented more than $12,000. Priya had not made a bad decision. She had made a slow decision. The market does not distinguish between the two. What Priya needed was not more courage. She needed a framework for compressing deliberation without compromising judgment. There are 3 questions that can collapse weeks of hesitation into days of clear analysis. The first question is this: do I understand the downside, and can I absorb it without catastrophic consequence to my current stability? Not can I afford to win. Can I afford to lose this exact amount and still function? If the answer is yes, the financial risk is within your range. If the answer is no, the opportunity is genuinely not for you at this moment, and moving on is the right call. This question eliminates the vague financial anxiety that masquerades as due diligence. The second question is, does this opportunity require me to know something I do not currently know, or does it require me to decide based on what I already know? This question separates real knowledge gaps from manufactured uncertainty. Most hesitation is manufactured. You already know enough. What you are actually waiting for is permission from a future version of yourself who has already seen the outcome. That version of yourself does not exist yet and cannot give you that permission. The information you have right now is the information available inside the window. That is what decisions are made from. The third question is the most important and the most frequently skipped. What is the actual cost of deciding 30 days from now instead of 3 days from now? Not a vague answer, a specific one. Will the terms change? Will the price move? Will the access close? Will a competitor fill the position? Will inflation erode the purchasing power you are planning to deploy? Put a number, however approximate, on the cost of waiting. Slow decisions in fast windows are functionally identical to no decisions. When you make that cost visible, the deliberation loses its camouflage. 3 questions. Do I understand the downside and can I absorb it? Does this require knowledge I do not have, or a decision based on what I already have? What does waiting 30 days specifically cost? You do not need a financial advisor to answer these. You need honesty, a piece of paper, and the willingness to do it before the week ends. Now bring this back to Marcus, who appeared earlier in this book navigating his first serious capital decision with $7,000 and a window that was not going to wait for him to feel ready. Marcus was a natural deliberator. He processed carefully, researched thoroughly, and had been burned once by moving fast on a decision that turned out to be wrong. That experience had installed in him a quiet but powerful conviction that slowness was safety. It is a logical conclusion from a single data point. It is also a conclusion that markets will penalize indefinitely if you let it run unchecked. What changed for Marcus was not a sudden burst of confidence. It was the moment he ran the 3 questions on a specific opportunity and realized the deliberation he was engaged in had already cost him more than the downside risk he was trying to avoid. He was not doing more research. He was producing the feeling of doing more research while actually waiting for certainty that financial decisions simply do not offer. Once he saw that clearly, the decision took about 4 hours. Not because he stopped being careful, because he redirected his care toward the right questions instead of toward the accumulation of additional time. This is the behavioral pattern shared by first-generation wealth builders who move fastest in closing windows. They are not reckless. They are not impulsive. They have learned, usually through experience and sometimes through hard reading, to distinguish between deliberation that produces better decisions and deliberation that produces only the sensation of safety. The second kind is expensive. The first kind is brief. As this book keeps moving, you will hear a point about the role of risk tolerance in wealth building that clashes with the familiar story. When that point settles, it shifts what you actually do the next time a window opens in front of you. The closing window that runs through everything in this book is not a metaphor for general urgency. It is a description of how specific financial structures behave in specific economic conditions. Windows open. They hold for a period of time that is usually shorter than the time most people need to feel fully prepared. Then they close, and the price of access to that same opportunity, if it ever returns at all, is higher. This is not pessimism. It is the architecture of every market that has ever existed. You are not behind because you are slow. You are behind because no one handed you the framework for moving at the speed the window requires. Now you have it. The question the next chapter will answer is not how fast you can move. It is what you do in the hours immediately after you decide. Because the decision is only the beginning of where the real velocity lies. Chapter 9. Your income is a ceiling, not a floor. Saving more money will not make you wealthy. That sounds like the advice a cynic gives to justify spending freely, and you are right to pause on it. But here is what the sentence actually means. Savings are a function of income. Frugality is a function of income. Every financial habit you have ever been taught, budgeting, cutting back, putting away 10%, every single one operates inside the boundary set by what you currently earn. The ceiling on your wealth is not your discipline. It is your income structure. If your income has one source, you are not building toward financial freedom. You are standing at the base of a wall designed to keep you exactly where you are. That question of what you do in the hours after you decide is where this chapter lives. The decision to build is only the first gate. The second gate is the structure you build with. There is a word that gets used in conversations about financial stability. That word is security. People use it to describe having a job, a reliable paycheck, a salary that arrives every 2 weeks like a guest who has never once been late. There is real comfort in that reliability. The kind that makes it easy to stop asking harder questions. But here is the thing about that kind of security. It is borrowed. It belongs to whoever signs the check. And the moment that relationship ends by their choice or yours, the security ends with it. What you thought was a foundation was actually a rental agreement. Bring to mind the version of you waking up each morning 3 years earlier. Not emotionally, not in terms of goals, but practically. What was your total monthly income from every source you had access to? Now think about today. Has that number grown because your life has expanded, or only because your employer gave you a small raise to keep pace with inflation? For most people who feel behind, the answer is the second one. The number changed slightly, but the structure of the number did not change at all. That structure is the ceiling. Here is the open loop you need to hold as this chapter unfolds. There is a specific mechanism that turns income from a ceiling into a floor. It is not what most financial advice points you toward. It is not real estate in the abstract, and it is not stocks in the abstract. It is something more precise than either of those, and it works differently depending on where you are starting from. Hold that question. The answer lands before this chapter ends. A single income stream is not financial stability. Say that again, slowly, in your own head. What it actually is maximum exposure to a single point of failure, dressed in the costume of security. One employer, one contract, one platform, one client. One phone call on a Tuesday afternoon that changes everything in 90 seconds. You have likely watched this happen to someone. You may have experienced it yourself. The disorientation is not just financial. It is existential. When you have built your entire economic life on one source, losing that source does not feel like losing a job. It feels like losing ground. The concept behind income layering is not complicated. It is simply the practice of ensuring your total income arrives from at least 3 separate sources, each with a different risk profile. Not 3 identical sources. Not 3 versions of the same fragility. 3 layers, operating differently, failing at different times for different reasons, so that no single disruption collapses everything at once. What makes income layering hard is not the concept. It is the sequence. Most people think you need significant money before you can build a second income source. That is false. What you need is a few hours a week and clarity about which layer you can access from where you currently stand. Let me walk you through how this works at 3 different starting points. The mechanism is real at each level, but the entry point changes. If you are starting from around $30,000 a year, your primary income is probably covering basics and not much more. At this level, the first additional layer is what you already know how to do, convert it into a deliverable someone else will pay for directly. This is not about starting a business in the grand sense. It is about identifying one specific skill, writing clearly, organizing complex information, fixing things, teaching a narrow subject you understand well, and offering it in a form that does not require infrastructure. Freelance platforms, local service listings, a single referral from someone who trusts you. The goal at this level is not to replace your income. It is to prove to yourself that a second dollar can come from a second place. That proof changes your mental model permanently. The second layer at this income level is time-based conversion. You take the hours that are currently unmonetized and assign them a single focused purpose. 2 hours a week building a small digital product, a short guide, a template, a resource that solves one specific problem is not ambitious. It is structural. It creates the possibility of recurring income that does not require you to show up every time it earns. The third layer at this level is micro-investing. As little as $20 a month into an index-based account, not for the return on that $20, but to begin the psychological and mechanical habit of having money that earns separate from your labor. If you are starting from around $60,000 a year, your income is generating some margin. That margin is the raw material. At this level, the first layer is still the skills-to-service conversion, but the bar for what you can charge is higher, and the clients you can reach are different. Someone earning $60,000 is almost always working in an environment with people who earn more and have problems worth paying to solve. The second layer at this level is the asset layer. This does not mean buying property immediately. It means directing a consistent portion of your income into something that generates a return independent of your time. An employer-matched retirement account maximized first, then index funds, then eventually a single specific real asset if the numbers support it. The third layer here is what I would call the knowledge premium. You have been doing something long enough to have real expertise. That expertise, packaged correctly, can be sold to people earlier on the curve than you. Consulting, coaching in your specific domain, workshops, content that demonstrates what you know. This layer takes longer to generate income, but it compounds differently than the others. If you are starting from around $100,000 a year, the ceiling is highest, but the false sense of security is also highest. This is where most people stop questioning the structure. The paycheck is comfortable. The lifestyle has expanded to meet it. The idea of adding complexity feels unnecessary. That comfort is exactly what makes this the most structurally dangerous place to stay static. At this level, the first layer is the ownership layer. Not necessarily ownership of a company, but ownership of an asset that generates income. A small number of rental units if the market supports it. Equity in something you contribute to. A stake in a business that is not your employer. The second layer is the advanced knowledge premium. Your expertise is valuable enough to command real fees from the right audience, and the mechanism for reaching that audience is now accessible in ways it was not 10 years ago. The third layer at this level is the portfolio, built aggressively enough that the compounding return begins to represent a meaningful fraction of your annual income within a 7 to 10-year window. Now here is where these three levels connect. The principle underneath all of them is the same. Meet a man named Daniel. He was 31, working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company, earning about $52,000 a year. He was good at his job. He had been told he was good at his job, and he believed in the way comfortable people believe things, that this was enough foundation to eventually build something. Then his company was acquired. His position was restructured. In the space of a single quarter, the income he had spent 6 years building his life around disappeared. He had 43 days of savings. He had no second source of income. He had skills that were real but had never been packaged in a form anyone could purchase directly. What Daniel discovered in the months that followed was not that he lacked capability. He had capability. What he lacked was a structure that did not depend on one relationship remaining intact. Daniel built the structure afterward. He did it under pressure, which is the hardest way. He now runs the same skills through 3 separate income channels and has not been fully dependent on any single employer for 4 years. He says the restructuring was the best thing that happened to him, but he also says he would never recommend the method. The hardest version of building income layers is the one you build after the single source fails. The easier version is the one you build now, while the first source is still intact, while you have time, while the window is open. Because here is the thing about structural windows, and this has been the thread running through every chapter of this book. They do not close slowly enough for you to notice the closing. They close at the speed of a market shift, a regulatory change, a platform update, a demographic wave that moves the opportunity you were counting on to somewhere you no longer have access to. The mechanism of income layering is not about getting rich on multiple streams. It is about refusing to remain at maximum exposure to a single point of failure. It is about converting your income from a ceiling fixed, singular, someone else's to give and take, into a floor that holds you regardless of which single thing changes. Here is where the open loop closes. The mechanism that turns income into a floor is not a single strategy. It is a sequence. Skill layer first, asset layer second, knowledge premium third. In that order, at whatever level you are starting from. The sequence is the mechanism. And the sequence begins in the hours after you decide. Not someday. Not when the conditions are ideal. Because the question is never whether you could eventually build this. The question is what the cost of delay has been every single year you did not. Chapter 10. Tax is the largest transfer of wealth you ignore. That question about the cost of delay did not end with the previous chapter. It followed you here. The cost of delay does not apply only to investing or starting a business or buying property. It applies to something you hand over every single year, something that leaves your account quietly and completely, something that the people above you on the wealth ladder have been protecting since before you were old enough to earn $1. You are losing money right now, not to bad luck, not to a bad economy. To a structure you were never taught to read. Every year you earn income without understanding how income is classified. You are paying the highest possible rate on every dollar. Every year a business owner one neighborhood over earns the same gross as you and keeps significantly more. The gap between you and them does not stay the same. It grows. Compounding is not only for your investments. It works against you in the tax code too. And here is the thing that makes this particular loss so quietly devastating. The mechanism causing it is not visible. You cannot feel it leave. You just notice at the end of every year that you have less than you expected. There is a word that poisons this entire conversation before it even begins. That word is avoidance. The moment most people hear about reducing taxes, they assume something illegal is being discussed. They pull back. They get nervous. They say things like, "I just want to stay out of trouble," or "I do not want the government coming after me." And that reaction, as understandable as it is exactly what keeps first-generation builders locked inside the most expensive structure available. The wealthy do not avoid taxes. They architect around them. That is not a semantic trick. It is a fundamentally different activity. And understanding the difference is worth more to your financial life than almost any other piece of information in this book. Here is the open question this chapter is going to sit with for a while. If 2 people earn the exact same gross income in a year, how is it possible that one of them keeps 40 cents on the dollar more than the other? Legally, with full compliance, without a single dollar hidden. Hold that question. The answer is coming. But first, You need to understand what is actually happening when the tax bill arrives. Go back to the version of you waking up each morning 3 years earlier. Think about what you were earning, what you were keeping, and whether you had anyone in your life who talked to you about tax structure. Not tax filing, tax structure. Most people have had the filing conversation. You hand someone your documents, they enter the numbers, you find out how much you owe or how much you get back, and you move on. That is not tax literacy. That is tax compliance. Compliance means you followed the rules. Literacy means you understand how the rules were written, who they were written for, and how to position yourself so the rules work in your direction instead of against you. For most first-generation earners, compliance is the ceiling. For every person who has quietly built wealth across a generation, literacy was the floor. This is the cost of not knowing. A salaried employee earning $80,000 a year pays income tax, Social Security tax, and Medicare tax on nearly every dollar above the standard deduction. The effective rate varies by state and circumstance, but the structure is rigid. There is very little room to move. A small business owner earning the same $80,000 has access to expense deductions, retirement contributions that reduce taxable income before the number is calculated, potential entity structure advantages, and timing strategies that can legally shift income between tax years. The gross is identical. The net is not. The gap between those two people, accumulated over 10 years, is not a rounding error. It is a down payment. It is a portfolio. It is the beginning of generational wealth, or the absence of it. Here is where most conversations about this go wrong. They skip straight to tactics. They tell you to open a solo 401k or an HSA or a specific type of LLC. Those suggestions are not bad, but they are answers to questions you have not asked yet. The foundational understanding is simpler and more powerful than any specific tactic. The tax code rewards structure. It was built to reward structure. Not income, not hard work, not years of service. Structure. The person who earns actively and spends passively pays the highest rates. The person who earns through a structured entity, invests through tax-advantaged vehicles, and deploys capital in ways the code specifically rewards, pays dramatically less. Those are not loopholes. They are the intended function of the system. The wealthy did not find a back door. They walked through the front door that was always there and that nobody ever told you about. Let me tell you about a woman named Priya. She graduated at 24 with a nursing degree and a modest amount of student debt. For the first 6 years of her career, she worked full-time at a hospital, earned a solid income, filed her taxes every April, and kept almost nothing after her bills. She was not reckless with money. She was disciplined and careful. But at 30, she sat with a tax preparer who asked her one question she had never been asked before. He said, "Do you do any private nursing work on the side?" She did. Occasional weekend shifts for private families, maybe $8,000 to $10,000 a year in cash payments. He told her that income could be run through a sole proprietorship. That would allow her to deduct her continuing education costs, part of her phone bill, her professional organization memberships, and her mileage. She had been paying full ordinary income tax on that money for 6 years. 6 years of overpayment, not because she did anything wrong, because no one had ever asked her the right question. She started asking better questions. She worked with a CPA who understood small business structure. Within 2 years, she had restructured enough of her financial life that she was keeping an additional $6,000 per year that previously went entirely to taxes. $6,000 invested annually for 20 years at a modest return is not a small number. It is a life. The story ends there, and the silence after it carries something important. Tax structure is not one conversation you have once. It is a relationship you build with how money moves through your life. The first-generation builder has a particular challenge here that needs to be named directly. Most people who grew up in households without significant wealth did not grow up watching tax strategy being discussed at the kitchen table. They grew up watching their parents file a return and receive a refund, which felt like a gift, and actually meant they had overpaid all year. The emotional experience of the refund created a false positive. It trained an entire generation to feel relief when they should have felt something closer to curiosity. Why is this money coming back to me? What did I overpay? What would have happened if I had kept it each month and deployed it? Those are not natural questions unless someone teaches you to ask them. This is the first-generation edge applied to tax literacy. You are starting this conversation later than someone whose parents modeled it. That is true. And you are starting it at a moment when the tools available to small earners, solo operators, and first-time investors are more accessible than they have ever been. The gap between what a CPA can do for a high-income W-2 employee and what a CPA can do for a self-employed person or a small business owner is significant. If you have any earned income outside of a traditional employment structure, or any possibility of creating it, the structural advantage available to you is real. And it compounds. Now here is the answer to the question you have been holding. How do two people with identical gross incomes end up keeping dramatically different amounts after tax? The first person earns through a W-2 and spends post-tax dollars on everything, including things that could be business expenses under a different structure. The second person earns through a business entity, deducts legitimate business expenses before calculating taxable income, contributes to a SEP IRA or solo 401k to reduce taxable income further, and classifies income in ways that reduce self-employment tax exposure. The second person did not earn more. They structured before the tax calculation happened. That phrase matters. Before the calculation. Most people manage money after tax. Wealthy people engineer money before tax. One of those activities happens in the space where the rules can still be shaped. The other happens after the rules have already been applied. There are two questions that every first-generation builder who is serious about structural wealth should bring to a qualified CPA, not a tax preparer, a CPA who works with small business owners. The first question is this. Given my current income sources and any potential side income, what entity structure, if any, would reduce my tax liability in a compliant way? That question opens a door most people never know is there. The second question is this. What tax-advantaged retirement vehicles am I currently eligible for, and am I contributing the maximum amount that also reduces my taxable income this year? Those two questions are not sophisticated. They are not advanced. They are the baseline of structural literacy. And the fact that most people in your income bracket have never asked them is not a reflection of their intelligence. It is a reflection of who had access to this information and who was never handed it. The window in this book has been framed as a timing question, and it is. But the window is not only about what assets to buy or when to buy them. It is also about how much of every dollar you earn you actually keep. The wealth gap does not widen only because some people earn more. It widens because some people keep significantly more of what they earn, and then deploy that surplus into assets that grow. If you close that gap at the source, if you restructure so that more of your income survives the year intact, you are not just saving money. You are changing the base from which every other financial decision in this book compounds. In a later section, you will hear a point about risk that clashes with the familiar story. After that really registers, it shifts how you evaluate every financial decision going forward. Right now, though, the principle lands here. The wealthy do not earn more after tax. They build before tax. And the moment you begin to do the same, you stop playing the most expensive version of the game. Chapter 11. The identity tax is more expensive than income tax. Saving less money makes you richer. That sounds like the kind of advice someone gives when they want you to stop being careful. It is not. It is what happens when you look honestly at why so many people who are doing everything right financially still find themselves 3 years later with almost nothing to show for it. They saved. They cut back. They followed the steps. And then something happened, a trip, a purchase, a decision that felt completely justified in the moment, and the progress evaporated. The tax code did not take it. The market did not take it. Something interior took it. And until you can name what that something is, you will keep experiencing the same erosion in different years with different excuses. This chapter is about that interior force. It has a name. And once you understand what it costs you, you will never think about financial self-sabotage the same way again. You just finished building the mechanics. You now understand how the wealthy position money before the government touches it, how structure creates the outcome that willpower alone cannot hold. That is the architecture. But architecture without the right occupant eventually falls. And the occupant of your financial life is not your income. It is not your habits. It is your identity. Specifically, the identity you have been carrying quietly without examining it since before you ever had a choice about money. Here is the open question this chapter carries forward. Why do some people learn exactly what to do, take the first few steps correctly, and then silently stop? Not loudly. Not dramatically. They just slow down, make one exception, then another, then it is 6 months later and they are back to where they started. Hold that question. The answer is not what most people assume, and you will see it clearly before this chapter ends. Remember the version of you waking up each morning 3 years earlier. Not in terms of your net worth, in terms of how you talk to yourself about money. The words you used in your head. Whether you felt entitled to want more, or whether wanting felt like greed, or like foolishness, or like you were reaching for something that belonged to someone else's life. That self-talk was not neutral. It was a tax. It got withdrawn automatically from every decision, every opportunity you noticed but dismissed, every conversation about money you avoided because some part of you did not feel like you belonged in it. That is the identity tax. It is extracted silently. Marcus learned this the hard way. Marcus grew up in a house where money was discussed in whispers and absences. Not poverty exactly, but scarcity as a permanent atmosphere. His parents worked. The bills got paid. But there was never a conversation about building anything. When Marcus was 27, he landed a job that paid more than both his parents had ever made in the same year. He was good at it. He got a raise within 18 months. He started reading about investing and actually understood it. He opened a brokerage account. He set up automatic transfers. For 4 months, everything moved forward. Then the transfers slowed. Then he moved the money to cover a vacation that felt earned. Then his apartment lease came up, and he chose the nicer unit because he worked hard and deserved it. Then the brokerage sat untouched for 11 months while the market did what it was going to do with or without him. By 30, Marcus had earned more money in 3 years than his parents had in 10, and he had roughly the same amount left over. He was not careless. He was not stupid. He was maintaining. Without ever deciding to, Marcus had unconsciously set a ceiling that matched his inherited sense of what a person like him could hold. Every time he exceeded it, something inside him created a reason to return to the familiar altitude. The identity tax was collecting its payment, and notice what is true about that tax. No accountant sees it. No pay stub shows it. It does not appear anywhere in your budget, but it costs more than capital gains tax, more than income tax, more than the fees on a bad investment fund. Because those taxes take a percentage. The identity tax in bad years takes everything and then borrows against next year. What makes this specific to your window, to the 2026 window, to the first-generation builder reading this now, is that structural timing creates a narrow corridor. The mechanisms that still allow someone without inherited capital to build real position are available, but they require consistent forward motion. Not perfect motion, consistent. And the identity tax is precisely what breaks consistency. It does not hit you on the bad days when you are already aware something is wrong. It hits you on the good days. The day you get the raise. The day the account hits a number that feels unreachable. The day you realize you are actually doing it. That is when the tax collector shows up with a feeling that sounds like celebration but spends like reversal. You need to understand what this mechanism actually is inside the brain before you can disrupt it. The human mind is a pattern completion machine. It is always trying to make your future match your self-concept. If your self-concept is someone who struggles with money, your brain will find creative and completely invisible ways to complete that pattern. It is not malicious. It is efficient. Your brain is trying to save energy by predicting a consistent future based on the most reliable data it has, which is your past. The problem is that your past was written in a household, a neighborhood, a cultural context you did not choose, and that context had its own relationship with money, often one built around survival rather than building. You inherited those patterns the same way you inherited your first language. You did not decide to speak it. You just did. And now you are trying to build a financial life in a language your nervous system never fully learned. This is not metaphor. Studies of lottery winners are the most dramatic proof. A significant percentage return to their original financial position within 5 years, not because they are reckless, but because their self-concept has a gravitational field, and that field keeps pulling them back to familiar ground. Less dramatic but more common is what happens to the everyday person who earns incrementally more, sees opportunity, and finds 1,000 rational-sounding reasons to delay, divert, or dilute every concrete step. The window does not care about your reasons. Here is where Marcus's story resolves. At 31, Marcus had a conversation with a woman named Diane who had grown up 2 neighborhoods from him, similar income level, similar upbringing. But Diane's portfolio at 31 was real, not enormous, real. When Marcus asked her what she did differently, he expected a tactic, a specific fund, a side income strategy. What she said was simpler and harder than any of that. She told him that around age 28 she had caught herself undoing progress and gotten very quiet and honest about what she actually believed she deserved. Not what she said she deserved when people were listening. What she believed at 2 in the morning when she was calculating what was possible. She told Marcus that she had spent 3 weeks just sitting with how small that belief was, not fixing it, not fighting it. Just looking at it directly until she could see it was not the truth. It was the weather she had grown up in, mistaken for permanent climate. Marcus took that home. He did not do anything dramatic. He started saying a different thing to himself when he moved money, not an affirmation. not a positive statement written on a mirror. He started saying, out loud sometimes and silently most of the time, this is what someone building does, not someone lucky, not someone different, someone building. He was naming himself into a new category. Slowly, the pattern completion machine started completing a different pattern. By 33, Marcus had not become wealthy, but he had stopped reversing. The account was growing and staying grown. The ceiling was gone because he had stopped believing in it. That is the resolution, not instant wealth, the removal of the ceiling. Now close the loop on the question from the beginning of this chapter and look at it directly. Why do some people learn exactly what to do, start correctly, and then silently stop? It is because doing the right financial behaviors while holding the wrong self-concept creates unbearable cognitive dissonance. Your brain cannot sustain the contradiction. It resolves the tension the only way it knows how, by making your behavior match your identity. Since the behavior is new and the identity is old, the identity wins. Every time, until you update the identity. And updating it does not require years of therapy or a spiritual event. It requires one specific thing. You have to decide, not hope, not want, not try. You have to decide that you are now the kind of person this kind of life happens to. Not because you earned it perfectly, not because your past justifies it, because you have chosen to occupy that position, because the window is open, because the mechanisms are in your hands, because first-generation builders who move in this window are not lucky exceptions to a rule. They are people who looked at the structure honestly and stopped waiting for permission to use it. Before long, you will hear a point about timing. Once that becomes real to you, it shifts the specific moment you decide to act that clashes with the familiar story. But right now, here in this chapter, the principle is plain. You cannot build a wealthy life while secretly believing you are not the kind of person wealth happens to. That belief is a tax. It is invisible on every form you will ever file, and it is costing you more than any other line on your financial statement. The question that Chapter 12 answers. Now that you know who you are becoming, exactly where do you place yourself to make the window work? Chapter 12. First-generation builder is not your limit, it is your edge. Every era produces the same quiet drama. A small number of people arrive at the edge of something, a shift in trade, a change in how goods move, a realignment of who holds power and who does not, and they cross it while everyone else is still debating whether it is real. They are not extraordinary in the way we usually mean that word. They are not connected. They are not cushioned. What they have is something sharper than either of those things. They have the particular clarity that comes from having nothing to protect, and that clarity, across every period of upheaval in human history, has proven to be the one advantage that cannot be purchased. You have that, right now. The question that brought you here, exactly where do you place yourself to make the window work, that question has an answer. And the answer begins with understanding what you actually are. Here is the open loop the rest of this chapter will close. There is something about starting with nothing that the people who inherited everything cannot replicate, no matter how much they spend or study or simulate. It is not a mindset. It is structural. And by the end of this chapter, you will know precisely what it is and why it compounds. Let us start with what you were told, either directly or through the silence of what was never modeled for you. You were told that starting without family money was a deficit, that the people who grew up with investment accounts already opened in their names, who heard their parents discuss real estate at dinner, who inherited both capital and vocabulary around capital, that those people had a head start that made your starting line unfair. You absorbed this. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere in the math of how you thought about your own future, you built in a discount, a quiet assumption that you were playing catch-up, and that catch-up was the best you could reasonably expect. That assumption is costing you something, not in money yet, in orientation, because catch-up thinking produces catch-up behavior. Catch-up behavior is reactive by definition. It watches where others are and tries to close the distance. That means it is always one move behind, always calibrated to someone else's position, always spending energy on the gap rather than on the ground ahead. Look back at the life you were living at that point 3 years back, not in terms of your bank account, in terms of how you thought about what was possible for you. Think about the specific ceiling you had in your mind, the specific number or outcome you quietly believed was the most you could realistically expect. Sit with that for a moment. That ceiling was not a fact. It was an inheritance. A different kind than the one with money in it, but an inheritance all the same. Here is what no one told you about where you started. The absence of a financial inheritance does not only mean you lacked capital, it also means you were never given the illusion that the default path would work. The person who grows up with a safety net rarely examines the safety net. They trust it, they plan around it, they make decisions that assume it will hold. And when markets shift or industries contract, that trust can calcify into paralysis. The safety net becomes the ceiling. You never had the net, and so you develop something instead. A metabolic relationship with resourcefulness. That is the phrase, and it is worth pausing on. Metabolic means it is not a skill you apply when things get hard. It is a process your thinking runs through automatically. You have spent years solving problems with constrained inputs. You have made decisions without a margin for error because there was no margin. You have found angles that someone with more cushion would never even look for because they would never need to. That habit of thought, the constant scanning for the edge case, the alternative route, the underutilized opening, that is not desperation. That is a trained perceptual system. And in a period like the one we are inside right now, where the most valuable positions are the ones not yet labeled, that perceptual system is the closest thing to a structural advantage that exists. Meet Dara. She grew up in a household where every purchase was a decision, not a default. By 19, she had already negotiated a lease, navigated a collections dispute on someone else's behalf, and built a side income reselling returned electronics before reselling was a recognized category. She did not think of any of it as skill. She thought of it as necessary. At 26, she looked at a small commercial property in a neighborhood the capital flush investors had not yet priced up. She saw what they had not bothered to see. She made an offer structured in a way that a buyer with a traditional down payment would never have designed. The deal closed, not because she had more money, because she had spent her entire life reading the room that others were too comfortable to enter. She did not overcome her background. She spent it. The first-generation builder does not arrive late to the table. The first-generation builder arrives unburdened. There are no habits from a family wealth playbook to override, no assumptions about which professionals to trust or which asset classes are appropriate for someone like you, no psychological sunk cost in a strategy that stopped working. You are, in the most literal sense, free to see clearly. That is not a consolation. That is a compounding asset, and it compounds fastest in windows exactly like this one. When structures shift, and the structures around wealth creation are shifting right now in ways this book has traced across 11 chapters, the people who move first are rarely the ones with the most capital. They are the ones with the most accurate perception and the fewest reasons to stay still. Capital can be slow. Capital can be sentimental. Capital that has always produced returns through a particular mechanism will wait for that mechanism to work again, even as the mechanism rusts. But you have no loyalty to a mechanism that never worked for you. You have no legacy position to protect. You are not defending an identity. You are building one. That is where you place yourself. Not at the back of a line, not at someone else's starting point. You place yourself at the seam, the place where the old structure is giving way and the new one is not yet named. That is where the first-generation builder has always found footing, not because it is comfortable there, because discomfort is a language you are already fluent in. Now the loop closes. The thing about starting from nothing that cannot be bought or replicated, it is not hunger. Hunger fades. It is not desperation. Desperation clouds judgment. It is calibration. It is the fact that your decision-making machinery was built under real constraint, which means it does not require artificial urgency to function. When someone who inherited wealth tries to find an edge, they have to manufacture the feeling that the stakes are real. For you, the stakes have always been real. You do not have to convince yourself to take this seriously. Your nervous system already knows how. That calibration is what makes the closing window something different for you than it is for someone who has been comfortable. For them, the window closing is a loss. For you, the window has always been your only option. You have never been waiting for permission to climb through it. Down the line in this book, you will hear a point about timing, about whether the window is already too narrow to matter that clashes with the familiar story. When that idea snaps into focus, it shifts not just what you do but when. For now, carry this forward. The first-generation builder does not carry a deficit. You carry a trained perceptual system, a zero-based starting position, and a metabolism for resourcefulness that inherited wealth cannot manufacture and market conditions cannot replicate. That is not a limitation dressed in encouragement. That is a precise structural fact. The window does not care where you came from. It only cares who arrives ready. Chapter 13. You are already through the window. You have been waiting to feel ready. That is the honest truth, and there is no shame in it. But notice what that waiting has looked like in practice: the saved articles, the mental calculations at 2 in the morning, the half-formed plans that felt almost solid until the week got busy again. You are not someone who lacks information. You are not someone who lacks desire. So the tension worth sitting with right now is this: what if the thing you have been waiting for has already happened? What if you missed the moment it occurred because you were still looking forward, still scanning the horizon for some signal that it was finally time to begin? The window does not care where you came from. It only cares who arrives ready. Here is what this chapter is going to ask you to accept, even if it does not feel true yet. You have already arrived. The act of engaging with this material, following these ideas across 12 chapters, returning after the days when you got distracted and came back anyway, that is not preparation for the window. That is the window. You are not standing outside looking in. You are already through, but there is a cost to not knowing that. And that cost is where we need to spend some time before we talk about what comes next. This section starts with an unanswered question until the argument catches up with it. Early in this book, the window was described as something urgent and external, something closing, something you needed to reach before it shut. That image was designed to create motion. It did its job, but there is a version of that image that quietly works against you if you hold it too long. That is the version where the window stays perpetually ahead of you, always visible, always just a little out of reach, always requiring one more thing before you can climb through. That version of the window is not a motivator. It is a trap. It keeps you watching instead of moving. And the wealth gap survives almost entirely on people who watch. Return to the life you were living at that point 3 years back. Not just financially. Think about what you believed was possible for someone who started where you started. Think about what you assumed about people who built something from nothing. Whether you considered yourself capable of being one of them, whether that possibility even felt like yours to claim, something has shifted in how you see that. You may not be able to name exactly when it shifted, but the person who opened this book and the person sitting with this chapter now are not quite the same person. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. Priya did not feel ready either. She was 28, working a salaried position in logistics, sending $200 home every month to help her mother cover rent. She had a Roth IRA she had opened 2 years earlier with $60 and then never touched again. She was convinced she did not know enough yet to invest wisely. She had read articles. She had watched videos. She kept a note on her phone titled Financial Goals, with 6 items on it, none of them dated. The plan was always to begin properly when she had more stability, more knowledge, more margin. The plan was always later. What changed for Priya was not that she suddenly acquired the missing knowledge. It was that she stopped treating readiness as a prerequisite for action and started treating action as the thing that produces readiness. She set up an automatic contribution, $40 extra per paycheck, going directly into an index fund she had spent 3 weeks researching. She did not wait until she fully understood everything. She understood enough. She moved. That was the decision, not the amount, the structure. Within 8 months, the habit was invisible. It cost her nothing psychologically because it never passed through her hands, and the momentum of that one structural decision made every subsequent decision easier. She was no longer someone who was planning to invest. She was someone who invested. Marcus came at it differently. He had been carrying high-interest credit card debt for 4 years, $11,000 spread across 3 cards, always paying the minimum, always intending to attack it aggressively once some specific future condition was met. A raise, a tax return, a better month. The conditions kept arriving and departing without the attack ever coming. The debt had become part of the background of his financial life, so familiar it had almost stopped feeling urgent. Almost. What Marcus did was simple and specific. He listed the 3 balances from highest interest rate to lowest, picked the smallest one with the highest rate, and directed every non-essential dollar at it for 60 days. Not everything. Not a perfect system. One focused move with a defined window. The card was cleared in 9 weeks. Something cracked open in how he understood his own capability. Not because of the money, though that mattered. Because he had demonstrated to himself that he was the kind of person who could close a loop he had left open for 4 years. That is what one first move does. It does not solve the problem, it proves the actor. So here is the move this chapter asks you to make within 48 hours. Not someday. Not next week when things settle. 48 hours. Pick one financial structure that does not yet exist in your life and build it. Not a plan to build it. The structure itself. If you do not have an automated savings contribution, set one up today, even if it is $25 a paycheck. If you have a debt sitting at over 18% interest, write down the balance and calculate what $60 extra a month would do to the payoff date. If you have no investment account, open one and fund it with whatever you have, not what feels significant, just whatever you have right now. The amount is not the point. The architecture is the point, because the window does not close on people who have made one structural decision. The window closes on people who are still deciding whether to decide. Here is the principle this book has been building toward this entire time. This is the chapter where it finally lands with its full weight. The delayed start myth, the belief that wealth building can always begin later, is not just a personal tendency. It is structural. The wealth gap is not maintained primarily by bad luck or lack of opportunity. It is maintained by the reliable human instinct to wait for certainty before acting, and by a financial environment that profits from that waiting. Every month you do not have an investment account, someone else's capital is compounding. Every year the first move gets postponed, the entry point drifts further from reach. The gap does not hold still while you prepare. It moves, and it moves fast. But here is what the gap does not account for. It does not account for you specifically, already being 12 chapters deep into a book that has named every one of its mechanisms. The gap counts on invisibility. You have taken that away from it. The window metaphor needed to reverse before this book could end. It was introduced as urgency, as something closing, as a reason to run. That was true, but the final truth is this. For the person who moved, the window is not closing. It is behind them. They are already through. The urgency was not a warning about the future. It was a description of the past few years, the years when the structural conditions still favored first-generation builders willing to act before the consensus caught up. You acted, maybe not perfectly, maybe not with full confidence. But you moved through the ideas, you interrogated your assumptions, and now you are 48 hours away from a structural decision. One that will make you, functionally, a different financial actor than you were before this book began. The window does not close on people who move. It closes on people who watch. You stopped watching. Chapter 14. Build now because the gap will not wait. There is a moment that recurs across every generation that has ever lived through a turning point. People standing at the edge of change, holding everything they need to step through it. And most of them wait. They wait for certainty. They wait for permission. They wait for proof that the timing is right. By the time that proof arrives, the timing is gone. The ones who do not wait are not bolder than everyone else. They are not more gifted, not more connected, not born with something special in their blood. What they have is a single, particular clarity about how windows work. Windows do not stay open. The people who understand that, who feel it not as a warning but as an invitation, those are the ones who appear in other generation stories as the ones who moved. You have been building that clarity for 13 chapters. This is chapter 14. And the question that matters now is not whether you understand what is possible. The question is whether you have already decided to be the person who acts on it. You stopped watching. That is the sentence that ended the last chapter. 3 words. And those 3 words contain something that took most people years to arrive at if they ever did. Because watching feels safe. Watching feels like preparation. Watching feels like patience, and patience is a virtue, and virtues are supposed to protect you. But watching the window is not the same as climbing through it. One open question is steering this chapter until the argument catches up with it. What actually changes the moment you stop being a person who almost started and become a person who has already begun? The answer is not what you think. Think back for a moment to who you were 3 years ago. Not the version of you who had it all figured out. The version who was maybe scrolling late at night, feeling that specific uncomfortable weight in your chest. The one that does not have a clean name but lands somewhere between envy and urgency and frustration. You saw someone else getting ahead. You told yourself you would start soon. You had reasons that were real reasons. Time, money, fear of doing it wrong. The gap between where you were and where you wanted to be felt too wide to cross in a single step. So you waited for a smaller gap. And the gap did not shrink. That cost you something. Not a number on a spreadsheet, though the numbers are real too. What it cost you was time inside a structural window that has a hard edge. The wealth gap does not pause while you get comfortable. It moves. The people on the other side of it are not standing still waiting for a fair race. They are compounding. They are inheriting. They are operating inside systems built to reward people who had already entered them. And every month that passed without you entering, the entrance got slightly narrower. That is tension, and it is real. But here is why you are still listening. You did not stay in that place. Something shifted. Maybe slowly, maybe in a single sharp moment. But something in you stopped waiting for the smaller gap and started moving toward the actual one. That shift, that precise moment when you went from observer to builder, that is the thing this entire book has been pointing at. Her name was Carmen. She grew up in a house where money was discussed only when it was missing. Her parents worked constantly and had nothing left over at the end of the month. Not because they were careless, but because the structure of their lives had been built around surviving, not building. Carmen was 26 when she decided she did not want to inherit that structure. She had no financial education. She had no inheritance. She had one small income and a stubborn belief that the pattern could break. She started making decisions that felt almost offensively small. She opened one account. She moved one amount automatically every 2 weeks. She had one conversation with someone who knew more than her and asked every embarrassing question she had been holding for years. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. Nothing dramatic happened for a long time. But she was inside the structure now, not outside it looking in. By the time she was 32, she had a foundation. It was not extraordinary by the standards of people who had started with something. But it was extraordinary by the standards of everyone who had come before her in her family. Carmen was not the finish line. Carmen was the starting line for everyone who would come after her. Here is what becomes clear when you sit with Carmen's story for a moment. She was not building for herself alone. She thought she was at first. Most people do. The motivation that gets you to open the account to make the first move, it is usually personal. It is the frustration, the envy, the urgency you feel in your own chest. But the thing that sustains it, the thing that makes you hold the position when holding feels hard, that turns out to be something larger than personal ambition. You are not building wealth for yourself alone. You are writing the first chapter of a story that has never existed in your family's history before. A story where someone, at a specific moment in time, decided to interrupt the pattern. Not inherit it. Not pass it forward. Interrupt it. The descendants who will benefit from your decision will not know how hard this moment was. They will not know that you made the choice in a particular year, when the structural window was still open, when first-generation builders still had access to levers that would later close or narrow or require connections you did not yet have. They will simply experience life on a different foundation than you found, and they will not know it was you who poured it. That is the weight of this moment, and it is not a burden. It is a distinction. Not everyone gets to be the first. Not everyone gets to be the one in the line of succession where the story changes. You get to be that person, but only if you act while the window is still open. Here is the answer to the question this chapter opened with directly. What changes the moment you stop watching and start building? Your identity changes, quietly and permanently. Not in a dramatic way that announces itself, but in the way that matters. You stop being a person who plans to begin and become a person who has already begun. That shift is not reversible. Once you have made the first real move, crossed the first real threshold, you carry a different story about yourself. And the story you carry about yourself determines every decision you make in the next 5 years. The window in the first chapter of this book was urgent. It was the image of an opening that would not stay open. Everything since then has been about helping you see it clearly, move toward it practically, and climb through it before the structural timing shifts. In the last chapter, you climbed through it. You stopped watching. You are on the other side now, and the work on this side is different from the work of getting here. The work on this side is building, steadily, repeatedly, without waiting for perfect conditions, because perfect conditions are the final disguise of the delayed start myth. You have seen that myth for what it is. It is not wisdom. It is the mechanism by which the gap sustains itself. It whispers wait until you're ready, and readiness never fully arrives, and the window closes and nothing changes. You have heard the whisper, and you have decided it does not speak for you anymore. This is the year you become the first line of a different story, not the last page of the old one. This is the year the pattern breaks. 2026 is the year you chose to be the turning point.